Good evening and welcome to our event, Indentured Students, Higher Ed and the Student Loan Crisis, with our distinguished guest, Professor Elizabeth Tandy Schermer. Our program this evening is part of a fall series of programs at St. Olaf on the topic of capitalism, freedom, and community. My name is Justin Merritt. I'm a professor of music at St. Olaf College and a member of the Directors' Council of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the organization sponsoring tonight's event. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues. To remind our virtual audience members, you're invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We're honored to have with us tonight Elizabeth Tandy Schermer, Associate Professor of History at Loyola University Chicago, where she teaches courses on labor, capitalism, and politics. She's written about these topics in op-eds, academic articles, and scholarly works, including Sunbelt Capitalism, The Right and Labor, and a collection on Barry Goldwater. Her new book, just released in August, is Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt. Professor Schermer, Ellie, welcome.
Justin, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm so excited to be having a chance to do this, sadly not in person, but virtually at St. Olaf and the Freedom and Community Institute. Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Well, as of this year, Americans owe $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. That is 50% more than the U.S. federal government has borrowed from China. You write in your new book, Indentured Students, quote, by 2019, more than 70% of students borrowed some amount to stay enrolled, and the typical student graduated owing more than $37,000. How did we get in this mess?
Oh, it's the story. It's the story. Everyone wants to say that it's the story of the best of intentions. And unfortunately, it's actually the worst of intentions, because it was the worst of intentions that this guaranteed student loan program, when there wasn't really much interest actually in lending to students, was actually done intentionally by the federal government to create this financial product to encourage bankers to offer student loans. And the guarantee was for the bankers. And the whole idea was this will actually be a way of avoiding the substantial direct investment in American higher education that would have actually kept tuition costs down for the American people. And it just snowballed from there in terms of actually how we ended up into the mess that we are in today. Because once you started with that Pandora's box of lending opening, it just became easier and easier to cut the funding for higher education because students, of course, and their parents could just keep borrowing more.
Your book is a work of history. You write that the National Youth Administration, quote, like so many New Deal experiments, never lived up to the promises to help everyone, and likely even exacerbated longstanding inequities. One analysis suggests that NYA unintentionally drove much of the 60% hike in state school tuition rates that occurred between 1932 and 1940. Higher costs made degrees even more unaffordable for those long excluded from the academy, unquote. You point out over and over how programs advertised as being beneficial for women and students of color ended up driving even more inequality. Why did we keep getting this result?
And because the question is, it's always easy to say, promise equal opportunities. It's very different to enforce it. And that is really the crux of the matter. And I think especially, where to begin with this? The crux of the matter is with the case of the National Youth Administration's, the 1930s work study program, which is different than the one we have today that was restarted in the mid-1960s. It was this idea that we are going to have this tuition assistance, that we will offer this tuition assistance. And it had this really interesting aspect of it where there was actually more money available for colleges and universities willing to admit students of color, particularly African Americans. And not a lot of college universities actually took that opportunity. They really actually didn't have interest actually in welcoming students of color into their campuses, with the exception of our historically Black colleges and universities. That really was the exception. And the heartbreaking thing was that that had nothing to do with the capabilities of these students, of students of color, then or now. And it was supposed to do it. And Aubrey Williams, who headed the program, he admitted at the end of the program's life that he wished that he could have done more, that wish he had done more to compel colleges and universities to actually do this. And the same was actually true in the 1960s. Less was done. The idea was, if we just have this guaranteed loan program and we have the 1964 Civil Rights Acts on the book, that should be enough. That should be enough to encourage colleges and universities to open their doors to people of color, to women in a way that they hadn't before. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It actually came down to students and their parents themselves actually pushing to be admitted into these institutions. And I think the other thing to think about it as well is why keeping tuition costs down matters so much to families of color. We have historic wage gaps where you have families of color, because of longstanding wage inequities, they're not actually able to, they don't actually have the accumulated wealth to be able to pay for much of schooling out of pocket. So they have to borrow more. And so putting so much in terms of federal higher education policy in the opportunity to borrow really disproportionately affects those who have to borrow more. And then, because that does nothing to deal with the inequities in pay, are not going to have the jobs or the pay to have them pay back. And then particularly in the case of women, as we now are finally talking about during COVID, are constantly leaving the labor market to provide care either to young children or to parents. And you can just see how it is this snowballing effect.
I don't know if you've been following the story of this Korean television show, Squid Game. Yeah. Apparently it's the most popular show in the history of Netflix. My students are watching it. There's an SNL parody. But I was thinking about it because part of the concept of the show is this psychological toll of debt. And in your book, you tell a number of short stories about students being overwhelmed by debt. I don't know, were there any that particularly stood out to you or affected you?
Oh my gosh. There's a couple, and it's actually from different moments in time. And I think one of the ones for me that was really heartbreaking was actually from a young woman, and she was actually a Michigan State University student. And in between applying for the federal aid, and this is in the 1980s, in between applying for the federal aid and actually enrolling, unfortunately, her father lost his job as an auto worker. And all of a sudden, the income that the family had was nothing at all compared to what they had put at those financial aid documents. And she's sitting there contemplating not being able, because I believe she was a sophomore, not being able to continue her studies. And these heartbreaking letters that she's writing, and she's not, when I delved deep into politicians' papers, she's not the only one. We have this sense that Americans have only recently been having a hard time with this debt. Actually, it's just that they've been more recently talking openly about it. That private pain was there in the archives in so much. And I never forget, I remember when I saw this, when I was in the Nixon archives going through it, that one of Nixon aides just dismissed it as grief mail, just grief mail. But it is painful stories. And actually one from the Nixon archives, I remember it was actually a father. He's trying to figure out how to put his kid through college. And he's also trying to pay for and this is in the 70s, trying to pay for the long-term care that his parents need. And he just can't afford it all. And I think that that's something that when we see that this is actually an issue back in time, it just makes us stop and wonder how long Americans have been drowning in debt for basic needs. Because this book is fundamentally about the student loan industry. I'm not going to pretend, but it also is a window into that we've been actually depending on a lot of government guaranteed financial products for our basic needs. And that government guarantee, in the case of student loans and mortgages for houses, that's for the bankers, not for the person, the everyday American, just trying to have a family.
You trace this story back to the 1920s and even before, and I think we do have this instinct or this idea that it's much more of a recent phenomena. Were things always this bad? Are we suffering from recency bias? Is there something that's gotten much worse lately?
Well, and I think, it's interesting when you ask that question, because because this is this is a story, actually. Everyone wanted a story of big bad bankers, but actually there's a lot of politicians who are just refusing to do the right thing in this book. But every chapter begins and ends with students and parents. It has to. And the first student that you meet is actually Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who signed into law the Guaranteed Student Loan Program. And it's actually him remembering about what it was like to try and afford to go to the small teachers college in San Marcos it was a teachers college then, and trying to figure out, and he's basically kind of illegally living in this room above a garage. He actually doesn't have his own bathroom, and he's showering at a nearby gymnasium, and he's barely scraping the money together to eat. And I think that that's really striking now, a century later, when we have reports, and this is pre-pandemic, that a third of college students were having food and housing insecurity. And it just makes us stop and think and wonder, where have we been? And I think the hardest thing for people to think about is that when we look at the college costs in the past, they seem so unbelievably cheap. But the thing to remember, though, is that if, for example, college costs were $7,000 in 1960 to do 1 year of college, that's more than half the average family income. And so it gives us a different way of thinking about it. And also because the cost of other basic needs, for example, like housing crisis, there's conversations about a housing crisis right now. There's also concerns in terms of inflation with food supplies. It doesn't actually map as easily back to the past, but we have had a hard time actually paying for college, even as it became more and more necessary just to compete for well-paying work, much less the fact that actually it's a public good to continue one's education.
Well, there's a lot there. You mentioning LBJ, I learned the other day, so President Nixon famously went to Whittier College, this small college, but I learned the other day that he was actually accepted to Harvard, but turned it down. So why did he turn it down? Well, because his parents couldn't afford Harvard. So he decided to go to the smaller school where they could afford. Now, it seems to me like nobody thinks that way anymore. I mean, maybe not nobody, but most people that I'm around, if you get into a big prestigious school, you are going to borrow the money and you are going to go. And in a way, it's comforting that poor families can afford to go to an elite institution. But something about that attitude rubs me the wrong way. Setting aside kind of the public policy, what would you say to the individual family facing that decision of taking on, generational debt?
I mean, it is such a big question. And actually, this might surprise everyone listening, is that I actually do encourage students to actually borrow through the federal loan programs. And a big reason I do with the federal loan programs, there are protections in terms of interest accruing, the ability to actually pause repayments, things like that. And I do it because the biggest fear is that a student is going to try and work their way through college when you can't actually work enough, or even if somehow you can through the part-time jobs that you put together, it's actually going to cut into your time for studying. And then you might actually not end up finishing the coursework, let alone the degree that will give you that opportunity, but you've still actually paid that money. And I think the question in terms of how much should a family borrow, it depends. It really actually depends on what the person wants to do. I wish because it just so depends on the individual family. And especially since the challenging thing when you're talking about these very elite schools, they have no loan policies often for students. And so the question is, how much are the parents actually going to be going into debt? And I think for me, I think that there's something that we need to think about is about, it is true that sometimes these elite institutions do have the pathway into better career opportunities and things like that, but it actually kind of shortchanges actually the really important and valuable education that one can start getting at a community college that is actually offered at other smaller institutions. like St. Olaf, like Loyola, which are not as expensive and have different options, and then state universities. And so I think the challenge is reeling all of the different options out there and having that, thinking it through, but also getting the chance to actually sit through and think through just how complicated these financial policies are.
It's interesting that you brought up working through school. I was having a discussion with this kind of between classes with some of my students. One of them is working a number of hours, and it's challenging. You write quite a bit about work study in your book. One passage that caught my eye, quote, recipients considered the work that NYA paid them for to be as worthwhile as studying. 90% of students in an Ohio State University survey considered the tasks they did educationally valuable. Roughly 60% considered their jobs as beneficial as their courses, unquote. Now, part of me wonders if that reflects more on the work or on the classes at the time. But but I have, I've seen similar things myself. People, sometimes learn a lot from work study and even kind of shape their career in that direction. Are we better or worse off striving to foster campuses that allow students to work, encourage students to work?
Well, and I think especially like the kind of work that they're talking about as being so valuable, it introduced students to this world of research. They're actually helping their professors doing important research. And it was just this eye-opening experience for a lot of these workers. And actually one of the pictures in the book is of University of Illinois students doing surveying work. And it's really incredible that they're actually being introduced to this entire world of what it actually takes to do the surveying for actually the kind of planning. And that's incredible. But also, I think the interesting idea about the different studies they were doing in terms of fish. This is a time when there's a lot of, and there still is, I live in the Midwest. There's still a lot of ideas about, what are the best agricultural practices, and the students were actually involved doing that. And also, it actually also introduced students to like librarianship work and all these other kinds of things. And it really opened up these doors. And I think there's a part of me, especially as long as students are, that the work study is mindful of making sure that students are getting good wages for the work that they're doing, but also that the hours work for making sure that they can still complete their classes. There's something very powerful about students being a part of the research done and all of the many amazing uses of the university. And I think the amazing uses of the university isn't actually just research, but it's actually community events like this where you can be in conversation with different scholars to broaden it out, that is actually open not just to the campus community, but the surrounding community as well, but including all of the students who might be a part of making that possible. I always think about when I was in graduate school, all of the students taking tickets and having a chance to be a part of it, as that actually just really sort of brings a campus community together. And there's actually something very valuable about fostering community that I think we should think about as Americans as well, especially in a very contentious time like we're living through right now.
Yes, in fact, at this moment, I'm sitting in the Media and Broadcast Services studio where a number of students work that I know of and are getting all kinds of interesting experience working with artists, working with technology, and it's a good thing for a lot of them. Okay, I have a little change of pace question, a histrious question. Okay, so you write, quote, during the 1947 to 48 school year, more than 1 million GIs matriculated, making veterans 49% of the student body and almost 70% of the men enrolled, unquote. I was actually scanning through the old St. Olaf yearbooks. They have them all digitized. And it strikes me that even here, that change in the student body was maybe as profound then as it was in the 1960s. The veterans were older, they had seen more of the world, they were less willing to be treated like children, given a curfew, chaperones, things like that. What did your research show how this change played out?
I love that. I love that story because, so I will say that I had a historian, and until he read the book, he was concerned. He's like, it sounds like you're taking a torpedo to the GI Bill program. So one of the things that I talk about with the GI Bill is that the federal government was very good at getting colleges paid on time for folks' tuition, but servicemen, and I'm saying servicemen for a reason, had a hard time. They often were not getting their so-called subsistence checks on time. Many of them struggled to actually stay in school. And when you learn that those subsistence checks were kept small to make sure that they wouldn't be loafing around as students or anything like that, it actually makes what incredible students those GIs were, even the more incredible. And that they really did, they were serious, they were studious, and they had an intensity of purpose. And it was really wonderful, because what a lot of people don't know about the GI Bill is that a lot of leading academics actually opposed it. One, a man named Robert Hutchins, who was the head of the University of Chicago, he actually said that it was going to turn college universities into hobo jungles. Well, he was wrong about that. It really did. By within a year, you had some of those, not Hutchins that I have found, you had some of those colleges and university professors who had been opposed to it, saying it was one of the most transformative things that had actually happened to campus life. And it really was what it means to actually open the doors to servicemen. And I think servicemen who recognize what an incredible opportunity this was to get a higher education. And I think some of my other favorite aspects of that's part of the GI Bill story is about just how hard they were actually working. But more importantly, that it didn't keep them from pursuing what they would love. People like Robert Hutchins were afraid they wouldn't have any interest in the humanities. They'd want this, but they did. And they pursued what their hearts and desires and really went with that. And the same was actually happening in the precursor to the GI Bill, the work study, that you just had this opportunity to open up all of the different fields of study within a college or university, and everyday people yearning and grasping for that chance to do it. And I think for me, that is one of the saddest aspects of putting so much on this, on tuition assistance and lending in particular, is the concern is just how much it's going to cost, that people shy away from the things that they might really love, the kind of things that keep them going, maybe when they don't necessarily love their 9-to-5 job, but they can come home and they know that they love music, that love the arts, the movies, all those wonderful things that we have in the humanities and fine arts.
Well, a big factor in this, of course, is that the price of college is going way up. An average degree costs more than double what it was when I was in college in the 90s, even after adjusting for inflation. Why is the price of college spiraling up and up?
Because colleges and universities are being asked to do more with less resources. There's a line in the book from a higher education policy expert, and he said, state legislatures know that they can cut the higher education spending. And it's important to know that private institutions actually also do get support from federal and oftentimes state as well, in different ways, not necessarily direct support, but that you can just cut that, and then that tuition can just be raised. And the expectation is tuition can just be raised because students can borrow. And it is this cycling. But I want to think about in terms of all the things that we are asking universities to do. And universities, by their very nature, should have many uses. The research that they provide, the community services they provide, all of these, the teaching, of course, all these different things. But college universities are also now expected to have food banks. They're supposed to deal with a housing crisis. Other universities, private and public, are being asked to make up for really big cuts into support for basic social needs. Actually, another one I think about too is that just how much medical services actually that colleges and universities are now responsible for in terms of providing undergraduates. And that all factors into the cost. And I should also say, we don't really realize this, is that you can't just install phone lines and hope everything's fine. You have to keep upgrading the technology as the technology changes, both to meet your research needs, but also, of course, your teaching needs. Where would we be without Zoom? And the possibility of being able to teach remotely during the pandemic.
So I think that's undoubtedly true. Another thing that may account for part of it, so Amanda Ripley wrote in The Atlantic, the U.S. ranks #1 in the world for spending on student welfare services such as housing, meals, healthcare, and transportation, more than 3 times the average for the developed world. Now, some of this, I think, is lazy rivers, condos instead of dorms, climbing walls. Colleges are much more luxurious than they were 30 years ago, and almost unrecognizable from 60 years ago. And I think this isn't just elite private colleges, but state schools as well sometimes are in a spending race for this kind of luxury. What do you think might be spurring this arms race?
You got to compete for tuition. You got to compete for students. And if that is a part of your marketing, and actually, it's funny you say that. I remember way back when I was actually first getting my my first college brochures in the mail and was just being absolutely into it. I remember one this is in the late 90s. Someone actually, a college, I can't remember which one it was, had a person eating a massive cookie, emphasizing that they had been ranked best in terms of college dining. But this is exactly the kind of marketing thing, because you have to compete for students, and people are competing for students in a lot of different ways. But I do want to emphasize it is true that you can see that sort of luxury creep, although I'm still remembering my state school unair-conditioned dorm in 100-degree southern weather. But that's not the reality of our community colleges, and that's not the reality of a lot of colleges that are doing such important work right now. And I think that that's an important thing to remember, is that those are the ones that get the stories about the lazy river. But there's a lot of other colleges and universities. And I think especially I was very disappointed to read this morning that it looks like community colleges are not going to get the support hoped for in the infrastructure bill, that do so much for people, and community colleges in particular, at all phases of a person's life. And it's a really heartbreaking sentiment. But I take the point, but what if we didn't have to compete for tuition revenue? Ways to justify those prices, I think, is something for us to think about.
Now, it's certainly true that along the way there have been cuts in government spending on higher ed, but I was looking, according to the Urban Institute, from 1977 to 2018, state and local government spending on higher ed increased by 180%. Federal outlays have grown over that period as well. I was doing the math. It looks like if inflation-adjusted per-student cost was the same now as it was in 1985, current government spending would cover more than 90% of the cost of higher ed, but instead it's less than half. It seems to me that a big part of the story is that we're a victim of the cost disease. So how do we address that side of the ledger?
Well, and I think also the really interesting work coming out of Harvard too is actually that a lot of the money being spent on the loan programs actually could really be redirected to support, to really provide the direct funding actually needed for campuses. And that could actually be a big shift in policy. And I think that that's the key issue as well. And I think also recognizing that it is this question about understanding what it actually takes to keep a university and college running, but also recognizing the support that is necessary for all of the many uses that we don't realize and basic needs that these institutions are actually supporting as well. But when we're actually looking at about just what it costs for the federal government to service with private banks, some of them complicit in actually making the student loan industry so bad before the end of the guaranteed student loan program in 2010, the fees that they're charging just for collecting the student loans, that actually sort of cuts into actually what the money in higher education is actually being spent on.
Yes, and whenever you subsidize something, you get more of it, and using borrowed money as the lever for that subsidy hides the true cost of that education from students, parents, and the broader society. So another quote that struck me, you said that LBJ, quote, particularly liked guaranteed lending because government accounting practices at the time hid how expensive this form of tuition assistance would be. So to what extent are the politicians, fooled by their own rhetoric, and to what extent did they really know what they were doing?
That is a great question. In the case of LBJ, they are all they're putting on there is the interest is the interest payments. That's what they're extra putting on the federal ledger. So they're not doing all the other aspects of actually paying for this. And that wouldn't change until 1990. That's a long period of time, 1965 to 1990. But I think what's interesting about it is they had such faith, these 1960s liberals, and they're Democrats and Republicans in that category. They had such faith in how a guaranteed financial product like the one for mortgages with housing. And of course, we now recognize the inequality baked into the federal mortgage program, but it wasn't as clear to policymakers in the 1960s. And we have a lot of great researchers to thank for that. But they had such faith in these kind of financial products, even though there's actually a government lending program before this. It's tied to the Sputnik legislation, the National Defense Education Act, a year after the Sputnik satellite first orbited the Earth. there were problems with collections there. There were problems with repayment there. There were problems with bankruptcies there. And those reports were known, and it still did not stop the majority of Congress from signing off on this guaranteed student loan program, and the executive branch, LBJ in particular, and some of his close aides from pushing this loan program. But by the time you get to the 1990s, that is known. And that cost differentiation was known, and it was still fought. And by then, the two political parties had really started resorting themselves, both geographically and politically, that it really became a partisan issue in terms of doing the reform, to recognize once those early 1990s government reports came out in terms of just how much that original guaranteed student loan program and how much would be saved by a direct student loan program would do. It was a partisan issue. And that is really one of those frustrating things when you actually see it and you actually have people admitting it. You have them admitting it.
Well, you, I think, favor direct investment, direct spending, but you also write about multiple times when government funding intended to cut the cost of education instead led to tuition increases. So every college has an infinite supply of good things to spend money on, new dorms, more research, higher staff salaries. But giving a college more money doesn't change the amount that students and families are willing to pay, which is the same as it was before. So tuition has no compelling reason to go down. And if the new dorm gets built, tuition goes up. And in fact, with a swanky new dorm, the college might even charge more than before. So, can this cycle be broken?
I think that's what, for me, one of the disappointments actually was with the end of the community college, the possibility of having free community college as the infrastructure bill. And that looks like what's going to happen right now. That was a big push that was happening. There were some progressive Democrats who wanted free four-year college at a state institution for families making less than $125,000. The big push, though, in the infrastructure project was free community college. It was a really interesting way that they were actually trying to do it. And the interesting thing about that, if you think about this, 2 years at a community college, that could have the cost of higher education for a family. It's fascinating, isn't it? And then also, if you want to keep as a four-year institution, it also puts pressure. It becomes this public option. And right now in contemporary America, people might remember that the idea of the public option, the last time it was really in public memory was with Obamacare, the idea of having a public option. But that actually stretches back to the New Deal, about having a genuine public option for utilities, about something that would actually have this public competitor as a way of dealing with the question of prices and having a different expectation. And I think that is an interesting question about what would it mean if we had and recognized the value of genuine public options. What could that were affordable? What could that do in terms of putting pressure on terms of how high tuition could go? And I think that's something that we should think about.
It's a great question. There are, of course, institutions where students graduate without debt. So I was just visiting home not long ago. I'm from Midland, Texas. And if you graduate from a high school in Midland, then you can go to Midland College, a community college that has mostly 2-year but also 4-year programs, for free. It's paid for by the Abel Hanger Foundation and then other private donors. So Abel Hanger is an oil man, and so this was his gift to the community. Charitable donations to colleges are already $46 billion. So I just looked it up for a sense of scope. That's about 3 times the profit of Facebook last year coming in as private donations. So why not just rely more on private charity?
Well, because private charity waxes and wanes, and the big question, and it particularly actually wanes during economic downturns, which is actually when students and parents need the most help. When most Americans need the most help, when we have an economic downturn, and we actually saw that during the Great Depression, we saw it during the Great Recession, and the other challenging thing with relying on private donations is that the donor may not want to actually do what the college needs. And so a lot of times with donations, they're targeted. And the question is, is what the donor wishes to donate for, the cause that inspires them. Is that what needs the college or university? And if we take the example of, for example, if a donor is really invested in the sports teams and the athletic teams and really wants to build a gymnasium, and that's what the donation money is going for, does the college and university need a gymnasium? What actually is in that case? But how do you come to a donor and ask, well, we know you want to do the donation, but what we really need to support our students is actually more scholarship programs, more funding programs. And that becomes the tricky thing, is because donors decide what they want to spend their money on and leaving it very targeted. And this can actually be very detrimental to some schools. It was in the news a couple of years back that Sweetbriar College, it's actually it's in Virginia. It's actually just south of Charlottesville. And so that prestigious women's college was actually going to go under, because even though it had a seemingly sizable endowment, so much of it was targeted to specific things. They were actually running out of the revenue, the general revenue needed to keep the school running. So if you're having something that's targeted and you can't use it to actually fit the needs of the college in general and the students in particular, that actually becomes a challenge in terms of just relying so much on private donations.
I spent some time at Sweetbriar years ago. There's an artist colony next there, and visited the library. I was sad to see it go. Yeah. Okay, I have a sort of navel-gazy question for you. So you write that in the 1920s, FDR said, campuses across the country were nevertheless turning out, quote, annually far more trained teachers than the schools could possibly use or absorb. As governor of New York, he had seen 7,000 qualified teachers out of work, unable to earn a livelihood in their chosen profession because nobody had the wit or forethought to tell them in their younger days that the profession of teaching was gravely oversupplied. So here's my question. Are we in the same situation for college professors now? So if subsidizing something leads to more of it, we have a worldwide glut of PhDs. Is it even ethical to guide people in that direction now?
Well, and that is a great question. And I also think that a part of the, one aside though, one of my favorite things about researching the part of the book that was about the National Defense Education Act, there was real terror. It's why graduate students got a scholarship and not a loan. Real terror that there would not be enough PhDs, that there would not be enough college professors. And that is one of those things that no one would actually think of now. I actually think I'm going to switch the question a little bit, which is one, actually, we need to recognize that so many universities actually rely on graduate student labor. Period, full stop. That is actually in a large research university. That's who's doing a lot of the small teaching, the breakout teaching sessions, and all these other kinds of things. And they're also relying on a lot of graduate student labor for the research done. But the thing I want to twist it about it shouldn't we be asking ourselves, not that you can only do with a PhD being a professor, but the question I always ask the graduate students here at Loyola in history is like, what can't you do with a PhD? And that's what's really interesting right now, is that in the case of historians, the American Historical Association has career diversity grants, which actually work with graduate programs to talk about career diversity. And in my case, I think of this question about, like, as a historian, I actually have a lot of knowledge in regards to public policy. And my question is that, as someone who, even in my first book, was really grappling with questions of public policy, why wouldn't I consider and expect that I could actually then get a job, even though I might not have done an MPH, a Master's of Public Policy, or my MPP is an MPP, and Master of Public Health? Why couldn't I expect that? And I think that we need to ask ourselves about, the question is like, not just what are the uses of the university, but what are the uses of the PhD? And I think focusing, and I think this is actually a detriment, I would say, to just focusing on the professorship, is that it puts the idea of the PhD as the end is the job, as opposed to this incredible moment. We do get a chance to explore and research and see where it takes you. And I have a colleague at a university, and she was director of graduate programs. And she said this interesting thing when she welcomed new students. She's like, the length of a PhD is about 6 or 7 years, which is about the length of the average time that an American right now is in any given career. So just let's think about that you're here for 6 or 7 years. You're going to be in this field. We're not sure where it's going to take you. And I think that opens the door in terms of actually the expectations for college and universities to put more of a push for graduate studying, not just to create more professors.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. So the question we all are asking, how do you think COVID is going to change this equation? So, familiarity with teaching online, is it going to make, for-profits more feasible? Are we going to have to pass on costs of pandemic preparation to students? Or maybe people will get used to the word trillion and there'll be a lot more government spending to go around. What do you think?
So my answer to that is that as a historian, I will tell you that what a crisis does is it just actually accelerates already existing trends. And so what had been interesting in terms of online education, I'll start with online education, was the idea that actually completely online, while sometimes might be okay, that actually the future really did seem to be hybrid. And I think that this is actually really accelerated that. And I think it's actually pushed more technologies in both good and bad ways. And actually, I will be honest, like my experience last year, it got me to flip my classroom so I have a more meaningful in-person experience with my students. And that means a lot to me. I also, in the question of with COVID in terms of spending, we were actually seeing a push already for more of that. Actually, since I don't want to just actually date it to a midterm or a political election, but there has been pushing from the Democratic Party to keep spending and keep going and pushing for more social reform actually within the last 20 years. That has gone unremarked because we're so focused on the divides between the two parties and the difficulty of actually getting something out of Washington. And so I think that the push for more social investment is there, especially as we have these big questions about why are so many jobs essential and so many people are not being it, recognizing what it takes to care for someone and the many people that the support that someone needs to provide care, not just for children, but for elderly relatives. And so I think that that's actually what's going to happen. I will say the thing that I'm also thinking about in terms of COVID-19, we have been told by the education department that they have done the last extension of the student debt moratorium. And I don't see clear signals that despite progressive pressure that Biden is going to do any kind of executive order. Maybe I'm wrong. But I really do worry in terms of, in combination with the end of the extension of unemployment, with the end of the eviction moratorium, and then you're going to have all those student loans starting to becoming due. This could actually be a very painful recovery. And I think that that's something to think about. And I also have to say, thinking about just a tragedy exacerbating or a crisis exacerbating already existing trends, the trend had been to more polarization in Washington and locking down, which is exactly what makes it hard to get things done and actually to have meaningful reform. And so that is what makes me nervous. But I will say that the American people can do something about that and getting there out in the streets. And the whole reason that student loans are on the nation's mainstream political agenda is actually because of the people that began to finally speak out about the pain they had, not just hide it, not just write to it, but speaking out and protesting and putting the pressure on their elected representatives to actually do something about it.
Slightly a different topic. So for-profit schools they've come in for rough treatment over the years, including recent administrations. You write, quote, journalists and lawmakers have heaped scorn on for-profits, which had continued, despite the 1964 Civil Rights Act, to be more accessible to women, citizens of color, and immigrants than public and private nonprofit colleges. So on the one hand, I think for-profits tend to be some cheaper and more focused on job training, but on the other hand, they tend to have lower graduation rates, higher default rates. Where do you fall on this issue?
Oh, and I think I want to give a shout out to the wonderful historian Tina Groger, who actually changed my entire opinion about the origins of for-profits. And origins of for-profits actually come in the late 19th, early 20th century about more and more everyday Americans wanting access to higher education, being excluded from the existing colleges and universities, and finding an avenue into these for-profits, which is, again, when they started getting so much scorn from these elite institutions. Now, what for-profits have done since then, particularly as they have gotten more and more access to student loan programs, that is a different, federal student loan programs, that is a different issue. And I shouldn't say just federal student loan programs, also Pell Grants. That's a different question about how they have taken the opportunities afforded by online education and really actually created courses that often are not meaningful in terms of actually being able to be used in terms of helping a graduate get employment, pernicious in terms of actually going after students to have them take out these loans, things that they were not understanding what they were taking out for, but also just the quality of education. But what I think we need to think about, and I think in terms of access, and I think this is something that's really important in the context of COVID, is recognizing that the traditional model of a college education for someone, and it's actually not that traditional, between the ages of 18 and 22. And then that you might actually, as you were mentioning earlier, Justin, in this idea that you go anywhere around the country you want to go to, is that that not everyone actually has that access to do it. And so to give the kind of options, and I think it's a question of like, what are the kind of meanings and meaning? What does it mean to have access to actually for profit institutions to be inclusive? And that, I think, one of the things that's really important in terms of thinking about the importance is the bridge into that. Community colleges are in the community. They tend to be a bit more accessible, but to actually beef up those options, and also for a lesson for more traditional four-year programs, what is it that we can do in terms of when we offer our classes, how we offer our classes, what the kind of support is to genuinely actually expand that. And that for-profits have grasped for opportunity, and many of them have not done the work that they had promised to do, and they are being prosecuted, and they are being prosecuted. But I think it also is a lesson for those of us in nonprofit institutions to think about how genuinely we're making this really important higher education experience for many people.
We're back with Elizabeth Tandy Schermer, this time over the telephone, so hopefully no more connectivity problems. Okay, so my last question to you before we switch to the general Q&A is, what should be done? So how would you advise President Biden or Speaker Pelosi on policy, given your historical perspective? What's your dream policy?
Oh, God. My dream policy in the magical world where Congress just does everything and everything is fine. So I do think that there should be a cancellation, and I want to say a cancellation and not forgiveness. Borrowers have done nothing wrong, and I think that we need to keep that in mind. Borrowers have done nothing wrong trying to get an education and working in the system that was presented to us. And then I also do think that there needs to be a real public option, and I think a public option that would be the kind of price competitor to do that, and a real investment in that as well. And I think that fundamentally will do a lot to think about college costs in the future, as well as this question of what are we going to do with those who had incurred debt and have nothing to ask forgiveness for, but they need their debts canceled because these were policies, again, started with the worst of intentions to avoid the kind of basic investment in infrastructure. Colleges and universities have been actually recognized since the 1950s as basic infrastructure, and actually since the late 1940s as something so fundamentally important to democracy. You know, the big report calling for free community colleges across the country in 1940, it was actually published 1947, 1948. It was called College for American Democracy, that so fundamentally is what it's about. So it's not just something for our needs for higher education, it's for our democracy in general.
Wonderful. Okay, well now to our general Q&A from our audience, questions submitted online either beforehand or in real time. So some of our students have been discussing these issues in their classes, reading an article of yours, and we have a few video questions to start us off.
Hi, my name is Cully Hauk, and I'm a junior from the Public Affairs Conversation program. In a Washington Post article, you say that student loan forgiveness won't change an already complex and unequal college financial aid system. As an alternative, you argue that eliminating tuition through public financing would provide a more lasting solution. My question is, how do we get rid of tuition at public colleges and universities without undermining institutions like St. Olaf, which compete with these schools for new students? Thank you.
That is a great question, and I think that it's such a fabulous question. And I think the question is not that it would be an eliminate, but it would actually be a competitor. And I think one of the interesting things that happened, talking in terms of actually how many private institutions rely on generous donors, is that actually it was a very interesting thing that actually happened in the 1940s and 50s as more states reluctantly, started to invest in public higher education, that you had more private donations going in because small private institutions like St. Olaf were recognized as such an important part of the very fabric of American higher education. And I think it really comes down to that this is actually the kind of way that actually spurs the kind of private investment in these small colleges and universities, these private institutions, which are going to offer such a different aspect. And I think also it gives institutions like St. Olaf a chance to really highlight how they offer something very different and also something very valuable in comparison to the kind of education, which is also still good, especially for many students at a big state university.
Great. Now we have another video question.
My name is Cami Stokes, and I am a sophomore at St. Olaf College, and I'm with PACON 280A with Jason Marsh. In your article, Fixing the Student Debt Crisis Isn't Enough for the Chronicle of Higher Education, you mentioned that campuses struggled in the late 1960s, quote, because the federal government had placed a premium on student lending rather than robustly funding colleges and universities to free them from their historic reliance on tuition. First, do you see a future where the majority of college revenue is placed on the federal government rather than on student tuition? What government reforms would have to take place for that to occur? Second, what are the incentives for the federal government to increase college funding over student lending? What are the potential short-term and long-term consequences? Thank you.
Those are all such fantastic questions. And I think the key thing actually I wanted to emphasize too is when I did talk about the 65 Higher Education Act providing some direct funding for college universities, it was also to private institutions. It wasn't just to public institutions. And the thing I think is important to remember is that historically, actually, there has been both local and state funding for higher education. That was actually who was left, along with private institutions and religious organizations, to really push, to really structure higher education. The federal government is actually kind of late to it in a real substantial way. And so I think what is interesting about looking at the proposals for example, the free community college that unfortunately is not going to be a part of the infrastructure bill, or at least it looks like, it was actually going to be state and federal money was going to actually going into that. So it actually reaffirms the importance actually of state governments actually fulfilling their historic role of contributing to higher education, not shouldering it themselves, but contributing it as well. And so I do think that there should be more federal and state, because not all states can handle this, but all states do actually need this sort of basic higher education infrastructure for their residents. And in terms of the incentives for politicians at the federal level to do this, voters. That's why I really do think is that it's, we have a tendency in this country to think that our civic duty as citizens begins and ends on Election Day. Actually, it continues from that, because we need to put the pressure on the kind of basic needs that we want. And if this is the kind of resource, this basic infrastructure, this higher education infrastructure, and the many uses of colleges and universities, then that means that we need to be vocal advocates for these basic needs that we have. And that is really what it is going to come down to. And I think the consequences of that, if we think about the second highest debt now that Americans hold is actually for college debt, what would actually happen if that comes down? And especially the top one is still housing. How much more accessible would home ownership be for Americans? And I think that that's something that we need to think about as well, as so many wonder what is going to be happening with the end of this debt moratorium, especially as housing prices continue to rise.
It's hard to start a family when you have this mountain of debt behind you.
Absolutely.
Another question from a student.
Hello, my name is Gabe Leapak, class of 2023. Thank you for sharing your insights so far. Since 1987, the number of administrators and professional employees at colleges across the nation has risen dramatically, increasing more than twice as fast as the number of students. How does this administrative bloat impact colleges, and could trimming the size of administrations produce a meaningful decrease in college costs for most students?
I think that that's a wonderful question. I'm really glad that you asked it. And the thing that we have to be careful about so-called administrative bloat, what are the reasons for it? And what is actually categorized under administrative bloat? I'm sure Justin knows too, knows their share of deans and assistant deans and all sorts of different things. But also oftentimes categorized under administrative costs is actually writing centers and writing programs. And that's actually a vital part of the university. And also some things that actually college universities are compelled to do. For example, having a fundraising office. It's called different things on different campuses, but actually the need to raise revenue, need to raise money, that's also a part of that administrative bloat. And I think when we actually sort of stop and think about all the things that are going into administrative costs, is actually simplifying the way that we pay for higher education. Is that a way to actually cut it as well and give the kind of meaningful attention to the parts that are actually listed under administration, the kind of support that they actually need? Because I really do think you cannot have a better investment at a college or university than in its writing programs. And actually, by the way, another thing under administrative bloat is actually career services. And career services is such an important research. I actually partner with them every year to do a series of events with our majors. I'm in a history department with our history majors about showing them all the different things that you can do with a history major or minor. But that's also that administrative bloat that we have to be very careful about in terms of thinking about it. Some of it definitely is, but we don't want to cut the kinds of programs that are really offering valuable services to students.
That's such a great point. At St. Olaf, we have the Piper Center that does career work, and I think I've had a number of students that have found it so valuable. We have one more question from a student.
Hi, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Olivia, and I'm a junior with the Public Affairs Conversation Program. So in your article, you mentioned the College for All Act, which would make community colleges free. However, it seems that free community college has the potential to fuel even more inequities in higher education by funneling lower-income students into under-resourced institutions that typically provide fewer opportunities post-graduation. How do you respond to this? And do you believe that the student debt crisis can be solved if there's already such a stigma surrounding the merits of a community college versus a large public or private university? Thank you.
Another fabulous question. I wish I was actually in the room with the students. That would be so much fun. I love that question. And I think actually community colleges are such extraordinary institutions, and it is a shame that there is such a stigma around them. And there's a part of me that actually hopes that Dr. Jill Biden, otherwise known as the First Lady, can actually really, no, I'm not kidding. Like, she is a community college professor. She has been. She was during the Obama administration. She's once again back in the Northern Virginia Community College, and that was such an important institution. I grew up in Northern Virginia. It's such an important institution to that D.C. metropolitan area. And I think that actually there is a way that I understand the fear that this just sort of channels low-income students and it really sort of creates disparities. But I think actually showing what quality education you can get into community colleges and giving them the support so actually it isn't actually just a cheaper option, but actually a valuable, affordable option that can reach more people. And also, I have to be honest, at different stages of their lives, why are we assuming that you should only be pursuing more education between the ages of 18 and 22? And as you get older, if you start a family or whatever ways that you sort of create community and roots, it becomes hard to move away and really seeing the value in those institutions. And I think that that's one of my hopes, actually, that Dr. Jill Biden will continue to be able to do is elevate the profile of these really important institutions and recognizing from the great work. And they'll be able to do even more work if they have the substantial public support to bolster them even more.
That's wonderful. So now we have a few questions that people have submitted during the program. So this one is from Eugene. I'm tempted as a classical musician to say Dvorak, but I suspect it's maybe Eugene Dvorak from Racine. He says, there's a lot of focus on college. The trades allow a person to earn a good living without a traditional degree. Any love for welding or electrician school? What about apprenticeships? These types of jobs aren't going away.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And I think the thing to think about, too, is actually what can we do to make sure that those vocational ed programs and those training programs are actually genuinely accessible as well. And I think for me, that is actually one of the sadnesses of how much policy has narrowed. And so when we talked, Justin, you and I briefly at the beginning about the National Youth Administration Program, that was actually just the work-study program for college was just one option. There was all sorts of array of things about what it was, what kind of services, public services, young people between the ages of 16 and 25 actually needed. And I think that that's exactly this question about vocational colleges and different careers that we have to ask as well. And I think we also need to ask, too, about what is it that we need to do now in this moment of COVID when we're realizing so many jobs are essential. What can be done to actually, talking about with the previous question about the question of stigma, actually show the value of these jobs, and more importantly, make sure that they're paid for in that same way. And I think the other thing, actually talking about even more narrowing, is that in the Great Society when the revival of work study was actually a part of the war on poverty, and it was only supposed to be one avenue, one aspect in the war on poverty. And we've so narrowed that when you have Michelle Obama and others sort of saying the secret to ending poverty is for everyone to fill out the FAFSA, that form for federal student aid, no, because we actually need a much broader support. And I think it actually speaks to the fact that so many important public services have been cut, that more and more of the burden on that is falling onto college universities, and we're not seeing the really important work that is done elsewhere and actually putting the value in it and the investment in it. It's about investing in the American people, right? That's what fundamentally we're talking about in an array of different ways.
So we have a question from Anonymous from Minneapolis. So Anonymous says, I have two young daughters, ages 9 and 5, and this conversation is not inspiring a lot of confidence about my financial future. As a parent to potentially future college students, what advice might you be able to offer me, given your expertise? Thanks.
Oh, I think the first question is that if you can save, I think that's one of the key things as well. I think also reading as much as how much this higher education landscape and the ways to pay for it might change, because there's interesting things that are being talked about now. And I think also really looking at, if you said Minneapolis area, there's some amazing schools in that area, which are not just, the University of Minnesota is a great institution, don't get me wrong, but actually really sort of impressing upon your young children that actually starting off in a community college, and there's some wonderful ones in that area, is a great stepping stone. And actually really putting the emphasis on that, I think is. And also thinking about the previous question, is that are they sure that they actually want for this college education, or is there something, another way, another trade or something else that would be as fulfilling for them? And thinking of this idea that there's always this opportunity to go back, especially if we value the importance of those community colleges as we find our way throughout our lives, because so many parts of our lives change as we get older, if we have children, or as the children leave the nest, in terms of thinking about, what are the opportunities and when might I want to go back to college for some more additional learning.
I couldn't agree more. As the father of two teenagers, this is something that I'm thinking a lot about, especially with the older one thinking about a college. I think I would just say, if you are feeling pessimistic about college, while there are these really serious worries and things that we need to think about, I also think it still remains a wonderful experience. Almost all of my students are glad to have had the experience, as long as they're able to finish and to do what they want to do. College remains a wonderful way to have access to much better careers, and I certainly plan on sending my kids to college, even though I know some of these drawbacks and worries that we all have. Here's a question from Eric from St. Paul. So can you share with us what inspired you to take on such a project like this? Do you have a personal story about student loans you might be willing to share?
I do. Actually, I dedicate the book to the 45 million of us paying off $1.7 trillion. And I actually talk about this in the acknowledgments of the book about how I came to this project. So I actually started on this in my very first research, which was actually looking at how did all of this industry leave places like Minnesota? I live here in Illinois, the New York, Ohio. How did it end up in the American South and West before more and more of it opened overseas? And one of the things that I learned was actually there was a real push to develop public colleges and universities in the South and West as a way to attract industry, because businesses needed, corporations needed college and universities for research, development, and workforce training. That's literally what it came down to it. And I realized this explosive aspect is that there was a lot of private money coming in to expand public colleges and universities across the country, because there wasn't actually the support from the state and federal governments that textbooks tell you there was. But when you look at it, it actually wasn't a lot of that. There was always this dependence on tuition, always this dependence, even in public universities, on private donations. So I was going to do this huge book. It's going to be incredible about all of this, like these different campuses, and tell these different stories and really show this public-private aspect to American public higher education. And then my father got ill, and I had to confront the realities of elder care. And I was cleaning out his house, and I found the documents for my student loans, which I am still paying off, that I signed when I was 17 years old. And I realized that I had no idea the history of these things. Where did this thing come from? And actually, not a lot of people did. It's just kind of this, no one even mentions it in the textbooks about, there's this loan program in the 65 Higher Education Act when there was supposed to be all this, like, this government investment. I was like, that's strange. Why don't I know this? And it seemed like a more accessible project at the time, because it wasn't going from all these different campuses. And when you work in political archives, there's different ways and strategies that you can do it. So it's still a very deeply researched book. But it seemed manageable. And it was really, that was the way that I thought that I could do it and actually have something that was meaningful, not just for me, but for 45 million of us. And that's really where it came from. And I have to say, like, I had this horrible, I think I shouldn't talk about this. I had this horrible moment at the end of the book where I learned that my uncle had died. And I had this horrible moment of realizing that this book project was going to begin with cleaning out a Schermer man's home, and potentially was going to end with me also cleaning out one. And I sat there, and I couldn't. It was a very hard news to have at the end of this, because he was such a lovely man. So I will stop. But yeah, the personal is always historical, I think, in any way. But thank you for the question.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think people are no more interested in history as narrative and the story of people's lives, and they're all intimately interconnected. So this
Absolutely.
question is from Ed Santuri, the director of the IFC. He says, how would more public investment in education supporting scholarships or grants rather than loans keep costs down? Wouldn't more available publicly supported scholarships and grant money also drive up costs?
No, I think it's an interesting question, because that was the challenge with actually what happened with work study. Justin, when you first asked me about work study, because all of a sudden, when you had these scholarships and these grants, colleges and universities knew that students were making X amount of money in terms of this, and this is actually exactly what happened with the GI Bill too, that therefore we could raise college costs. And I think that that's where the question becomes, is what can you do in terms of making sure that that's why I prefer, instead of tuition assistance, whether in the forms of grants or loans or scholarships, I actually prefer the direct funding to cover the costs needed for education. And I think that that's the question that I have, is because it still doesn't tackle the part that we have these scholarships, for example, like the Pell Grant, these scholarships to cover a portion of the costs. Well, that actually also means that there's still this emphasis on the tuition, but if we can start actually loosening the emphasis on tuition and guaranteeing the kind of investment that makes it less of what a college depends on to stay open, then it has a more meaningful impact in terms of controlling costs. And I think there's also some room there too in terms of thinking about more regulation and opening up the books to actually see what tuition money is actually being spent on. One of the things I appreciated actually being in some public university systems, there were rules about what tuition revenue was supposed to be spent on, and I think that that's very important.
Okay, the last question for tonight comes from Justo Fritas. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He's a sophomore at St. Olaf College. Justo asks, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, education is a human right. Seeing this American student loan problem, do you think college should be free for students who are from low-income families?
I think that there's a very compelling case for that. And actually, one of the things I should say that we should talk about in terms of the College for All Act, there was also an emphasis on not just actually bolstering the resources for families making under $125K, but also a substantial investment in the historically Black college universities, the minority-serving institutions that have disproportionately been serving low-income families who still remain disproportionately families of color. And I think that is actually this question about that we need to make sure need to make sure that there is genuine access, that there is genuine inclusion in this really important question about higher education. And I have to say, I think the thing that I like about tying it to this question of family income too, it opens up the possibility if someone, for example, a parent later in life needs to go back to university, which many people who had been working in manufacturing before the 1970s did, it gives that possibility to keep the doorway to higher education open for longer and recognizing it as something as a basic. And I love that it's true. It is a human right, but I also think it's a public good. It's good to have a society with a well-educated society, broadly educated. I've been lucky enough to teach in England. There's something amazing about American liberal arts education where you get to really pull from and talk about. And I think supporting that and making that genuinely accessible across a person's lifespan, regardless of their income, there's something very powerful and important about that in terms of who we are in this democratic experiment for our public good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this thought-provoking conversation with Elizabeth Tandy Schermer, author of the new book, Indentured Students, How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt. And thank you, Ellie, for being with us this evening and sharing your research and ideas.
Thank you. And thank all of you who dialed in for us tonight and submitted such great questions.
Yes. The St. Olaf Institute for Freedom and Community has one more virtual event scheduled this fall, Michael Kazin, on moral capitalism in the Democratic Party. So learn more about this event and our spring lineup at institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us. For help in organizing our event tonight, very special thanks go to Institute Director Edmund Santuri and Associate Director Eric Grell. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Aaron Golden of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Finally, thanks to the St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation, which is supported by the Institute. For now, good evening from the Hill.